Of all the powerful men I mentioned in our last segment, there is one man I left out who is named in the Justice Department's latest Epstein release thousands of times. Can you guess who?
Donald J. Trump.
We already knew Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were friends until they had a falling out, supposedly in the 2000s. Trump has repeatedly denied any wrongdoing or knowledge of Epstein's crimes.
And it's not just that Trump's name is in the files. It's in the files thousands of times. According to the New York Times, they identified more than 5,300 files containing more than 38,000 references to Mr. Trump, his wife, his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida, and other related words and phrases in the latest batch of emails, government files, videos, and other records released by the Justice Department. Previous installments of the Epstein files, which the department released late last year, included another 130 files with Trump-related references. Joining us now, Steve Eder, an investigative reporter for the New York Times. Steve, we were talking to one of the survivors earlier and said, look, the media is obviously very, very focused on Donald Trump, and clearly there's a lot more to this, as Stephanie just outlined in the last block. Lots and lots and lots of other men involved, and the accountability involves everybody. But let's talk about Donald Trump for a second, because he has for a long time maintained he didn't have much of a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein claimed they were best friends. What do you take away from all these references?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think even before this latest release of records, a picture had emerged, of a relationship. They were good friends at a time, a time that goes back, at this point, a couple decades, 2004 and earlier. They were friends on the scene together, in that period. The records, though, start filling in the blanks some more. I think that we already learned quite a lot in the fall from some of the earlier sets of records, but surely there's more here. You see, more examples of I guess, of that relationship and, how it goes back in time.
It obviously, as I went through, was not just Trump. I just mentioned a few: Elon Musk, Steve Tisch, Howard Lutnick, British billionaire Richard Branson. You got New York real estate mogul Andrew Farkas. What other names in here really stood out to you in terms of their communication with Jeffrey Epstein and wrongdoing or just inappropriateness?
Well,
Bill Gates,
sure,
President Clinton.
Yeah, I think at this point, look, I've been on this story, to some extent off and on for 6 years now. So, plenty of other reporters have too. And I think when we look at a lot of these names are familiar to us, the names that you just mentioned. I think there were some here that were new. Tisch, for example, I think was one that we hadn't been on our radar. So I think you start to see, I think it's one of the things that's not a whole lot surprises you.
Okay, then what was as somebody who's been in this for 6 years, in the last 5 days, going through all these emails, what was your biggest aha?
Well, I think you start to see some of the really granular back and forth, some of the communications with Epstein himself. The thing that struck me was the piece that we published today, where you can see Epstein drafting emails to people that had this knowing tone to them about shared secrets and having this feeling like he knew things. And
almost implied blackmail. Like there's something else. Some of them were just chummy. Some people were asking for dating advice, which is weird. Some people were asking for financial advice. But there was this thing about, I know something.
Yeah, I think you can see that. I think especially in some of his particularly important relationships that there were this sort of notion of him at least acting like he had shared secrets, he had something, and that they had a loyalty to each other.
For people who haven't read the article, can you give us an example?
Yeah, sure. So today's piece, we focused on...
just by the way, the title, Gang Stuff and Illicit Trysts, How Epstein Sought Leverage with the Wealthy. Get granular for us.
Yeah, for sure. And so this piece, we focused on one of Jeffrey Epstein's most important relationships, his early relationship with Leslie Wexner, the retail tycoon who's behind Victoria's Secret and The Limited. Really an important relationship that helped Epstein accumulate his wealth early on. Wexner
eventually signed off his entire fortune to him.
Which is wild.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. And then in 2007, they cut ties, right? So what we found was in the newly released records that years later, Epstein seemed to be seeking to rekindle or to reconnect on the relationship. He had been rebuffed on an offer to try to meet with Wexner. What happens next is Epstein appears to be drafting a letter to Wexner where he starts to craft out, a sense of allegations about their relationships, of this shared history around them. Wexner, in his folks say this is completely ridiculous. These are lies. It's innuendo, and this is coming from a liar.
But Wexner's team has never explained why on earth this man would sign over his entire fortune to another grown man.
Well, it's been one of the big questions, that we've been following. We've been very interested in the money and trying to piece together the business life, the financial life of Jeffrey Epstein over all these years. That's been one of the priorities for me in my reporting, and trying to understand the relationship with Wexner, the money that traveled there, and then in other relationships as well.
Steve, thank you for your excellent reporting on this. I suspect you may be on this for several more years. Steve Eater is an investigative reporter with the New York Times.